Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the GameWeek 15 cheat sheet. If you haven't watched the cheat sheet series before, it's effectively an evaluation of all the price points in FPL and all the positions, looking at players who would be great to transfer in or great to transfer out or even hold, for example, for the short term, right? Looking and forecasting into the fixtures ahead, also looking into, for example, what managers have said, any injury updates, so on and so forth, and of course the underlying stats, based on historically last season, and also sort of looking at, of course, any changes this year, any trends that we've noticed. Just before we jump onto the start of the cheat sheet, I would really like to request for you guys to potentially subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. 50% of my viewers, unfortunately, are not subscribed, and the goal for this channel really is to try to get to 20,000 subscribers at the end of the season. I hope the content has been really helpful to you in your FPL campaign so far, and looking forward to, of course, interacting with you all for the rest of the season. As far as, let's say, the midfielder position, if we jump into that quickly, we have some changes in the 5.x position. Gordon obviously has sort of been priced out of it. He's now moved into the 6.x position, but I think Hee-Chan right now looks like the king of this position. The reason why is simply because we still expect him to be the penalty taker. Now, of course, there can be, of course, the asterisk situation where Kuna can come in and of course take a penalty if he draws the penalty himself. But the last penalty was taken by Hwang and he earned it himself. The only issue with Hwang really is just that he is on 4 yellow cards. So of course there is a concern there where as soon as he gets a yellow card, he will get a 1-game suspension. However, I do think he's worth the punt because at that sort of price point, you don't have a player who is that expected goal dominant, and Hwang of course is. His underlying stats have also shot up this season, and part of that is because I think this Wolves team have simply leveled up, as an attacking side under Gary O'Neill. And so Hee-Chan of course does great, and you can see of course the change in his underlying stats from last season to this season, and not to mention of course he's now a midfielder. So I do think he's an absolutely electric option. Palmer drops. We knew somehow after the deadline that Palmer might have suffered a knock. No one has really spoken about it. I still haven't seen, for example, whether Pochettino has mentioned it, but of course Palmer actually ended up being dropped. And of course, the unlikely situation that Chelsea got a penalty and Palmer was not on the field actually did arise. And of course, Enzo took that penalty, but I'm not really thinking that Palmer's position in the team is, let's say, lost, for example, as a first string player. But it is a bit concerning, of course, what happened there, what led to the benching. And for that reason, of course, I have to drop him. And that, of course, changes the landscape of the budget mids as well. As far as Gibbs, White, and Johnson, I think the only concern really with Johnson, who, of course, doesn't have penalties in this list, is that the issue, of course, is Richarlison is coming back into the team and he could take some minutes. What we've seen as of late, though, is Kulusevski, of course, has been able to play in a midfield role. But we know that as the game changes, as the game progresses, we know that Kulusevski sometimes will be pushed out wide. And of course, some other changes will be put in. And that might, for example, lead to Johnson staying on the field, but that could also lead to Johnson actually leaving the field and departing early. So that for me is the concern with Johnson and why I haven't actually risen him to the top level. Because for me, this Tottenham attack looks astoundingly good. And honestly, Johnson seems like one of those budget picks that you sort of want to tap into, but I still think it's a bit of a risk right now. And of course, we need to see what happens when Richarlison comes back, whether, for example, Bryan Hill will keep his position in the team or Johnson, and so on and so forth. As far as the 6.x position, we have, for example, Gordon joining at that sort of top tier echelon right now. I do think I made a mistake in terms of dropping Gordon 2 weeks ago. I thought, of course, looking at those Chelsea and Man United fixtures, probably didn't really foresee Gordon getting some great holes, but he did. And ultimately, the reality is when you look at his underlying stats, that they're very good, and they're also very similar to last season. But the key thing, of course, is that this Newcastle team have once again seemingly leveled up in terms of attack in comparison to where they were in the previous season. And now, obviously, Gordon has become from a 50-60 minute type of player to 90 minutes, which is something obviously we knew as soon as the Barnes injury happened. But I think the thing is that Gordon has been able to sort of keep that level up, which is something that I thought would maybe drop potentially. And someone, for example, who's able to actually replicate such crazy stats, I would say, at that sort of sample size, at playing 90 minutes a game, is something that's new for Gordon. And so I think he is, for example, one of those options where he is at a ridiculous price point for what he is. And ultimately, I would say potentially the next best game week to bring Gordon is game week 17. I know a lot of people will probably be thinking about moving to Gordon immediately, but such is the landscape of FPL, where I think Gordon, of course, is an incredible pick. As far as Kudus, I think he's been a huge overperformer this season, and that's not crazy because I think Kudus is someone that we knew was an absolutely wonderful football player. But so far, of course, both Bowen and Kudus have overperformed their underlying stats quite a fair bit. And they have been, in a sense, carrying this West Ham attack as well. What I like about Kudus, of course, as I've mentioned recently, and why I've given him rises is simply because, of course, a lot of injuries in this West Ham team have meant that Kudus have basically nailed his minutes. But I also think that because he's such a key player right now, you can't even question his minutes. So I think Kudus is a fantastic option. The only concern, of course, is the next two fixtures are pretty tough. Tottenham, Fulham. Now, of course, you'll talk about the Tottenham defense, but I also think it also requires, for example, a pretty competent defense or competent attack rather, to be able to sort of break apart that Tottenham defense as easily as it looks. And Aston Villa and Man City, of course, are one of the best attacks in the league compared to, let's say, West Ham, where I would say you'd probably find them around mid-table, as an attack. So I don't think we need to overstate, for example, how bad this Tottenham defense is. But of course, this might not look like a red fixture on paper, and that's fair enough if you sort of look at it like so. But I still think home and away is a big thing here, and probably Kudus, once again, like Gordon, is a very good transfer on paper for GameWeek 17. As far as Doku at the sort of position here, I put an asterisk over him because I'm not exactly sure what led to the substitution in the Man City game. We need to sort of reassess. That's why we have an asterisk over Palmer and Doku, because hopefully press conferences in the future will sort of alert us to what exactly is going on. The same sort of situation with Mbumo, who for the first time this season, after basically being unsubbed for most of the year, actually got subbed off really early in that game. And so I think there is a concern over Mbumo, but hopefully he's fit to go for this midweek fixture here versus Brighton. And ultimately, of course, I think the biggest thing with Mbumo is hopefully being able to keep him up until game week 18. Because when we're talking about, let's say, the blank game week fixture, I think that's another great opportunity in game week 18 to maybe move Mbumo out. Now, you could also move Mbumo out, let's say, on game week 17 versus Aston Villa, but that's the sort of landscape in FPL where I think some of the midfielders that we've invested into recently are probably worth sort of switching around on game week 17, because players like Palmer, for example, have a great fixture. Gordon has a great fixture as well. So does Kudus. So it's a question, of course, who you're going to own by game week 17/18. And I think you can't pick them all. That's the reality of the midfield landscape. And we can all obviously try our best and hope that our players truly deliver, because right now we have a lot of options and they're all delivering very well. With Foden, of course, the concern I think is just minutes and how he'll be managed over the next two fixtures as well. He was an early sub in that Tottenham game. I don't think he played particularly bad or anything, but I do think Pep is also trying to manage the minutes of all his players during this run. So of course that's a little bit of a concern there, on top of the fact that of course City, they themselves will be one of the blank game week fixtures. As far as, let's say, Bowen, he drops in my opinion just because I think at that sort of price point, when we're looking at the midfield landscape and we have so many players who are either on penalties or have great underlying stats, I do think that Bowen at this price point is a little bit overpriced, and I have to drop him just because, of course, the next two fixtures are away fixtures, which are usually, of course, worse when we're talking attacking returns. So I do think Bowen drops. Yes, of course, it's nice to see him play center forward, but I also think that when we've seen the center forward game so far, actually it doesn't look particularly good for Bowen as well. As far as, let's say, the sort of premium midfielders, no changes here once again. I think we could reintroduce Odegaard soon, but I think I don't really want to jump the gun too quickly. I do think, of course, Odegaard, he did step up really in the last game versus Wolves, but that is really just one game of sample size. And yes, of course, he could also be sometimes on penalties for this Arsenal team. But I think the concern really with Odegaard is, do you really want to be spending that much money on an Arsenal midfielder if you already own Saka? And I still think that it's a little bit of a stretch right now to own Odegaard right now in FPL. And moving on quickly towards the forwards here, we have not too many changes, but just a little bit of movement around that sort of budget price point. What we have, of course, is some changes around some of the 5.x players. Cunha gets a rise because, as I said, of course, you're coming away from an Arsenal fixture. Of course, he scored there, but that's not the reason why he rises. The reason why he rises is because we have two great fixtures coming up. Burnley and Nottingham Forest, this is the time to invest into Cunha if you want to. One of my concerns, as I said, with this position, of course, is that I still think that the ceiling, for example, for some of these picks is still lower than the midfielders. And right now, 3-5-2 still seems to be, in my opinion, the best meta template. Unless, of course, you, let's say, want to own, for example, something like maybe Watkins, Solanke, and, for example, Haaland, if you own Haaland in that sort of structure. Of course, if you're Haaland less, it might make a bit more sense where you have 8 attackers and you're actually flexibly rotating between them, but that's a different situation. So right now, I still think that, for example, none of the options here are, for example, comparable to someone like Solanke, who is a penalty taker, and of course, someone who has really good underlying stats in a team that's actually improved as an attacking unit so far. And that's what we've seen so far under Iraola, and no surprise, of course, that Solanke scored a goal in his previous fixture. So looking at, for example, Edouard and João Pedro, I think it's nice to sort of put them level again. João Pedro just greatly benefits simply from the situation with Ansu Fati. Now, of course, Lallana can obviously play these league fixtures for this Brighton team, but I think João Pedro, he does play enough minutes for me to warrant him being a yellow option. We always have talked about him as sort of being a semi-cheat code because, an attacker for Brighton at that sort of price point, also being on penalties, is something quite ridiculous. And that's why I think João Pedro still deserves a rise this week. As far as, let's say, Semenyo, he's been introduced to the cheat sheet, but I still think, for example, I would not be spending transfers to try and move away from, let's say, Archer to Semenyo to Wood, because these options still pale in comparison. And it's sort of like spending additional money for not that much upside, because Archer, of course, is nice on the bench. He's probably second, third, or even first on your bench, depending on the game week, depending on the fixture. Now, obviously, Sheffield United probably are one of the worst teams we've ever seen in the Premier League, but I just think that it's not like Semenyo is that much of a step up or Wood is that much of a step up at times. So for that reason, I don't really think there's any sort of need to sort of spend transfers on Archer. As far as obviously the other forward positions, no changes here. I do think, of course, a lot of people will be complaining about, let's say, Darwin and his lack of finishing. But I think just looking at Darwin, for example, one thing I would always say about Darwin is he gets enough chances and he creates enough chances each game for even the fact that him being a poor finisher still sort of makes up for it. So I would say, for example, with Darwin, yes, of course, he sort of wasted a lot of opportunities versus Fulham. But one of the key things to sort of mention as well with someone like Darwin is that if you look this season, if you look at his, for example, expected goals plus expected assists, and then compare that to his goals plus assists, he's actually, for example, overperformed on goals and assists. And the reason why is because even though Darwin's a very, very poor clinical finisher, actually he's gotten a lot of his assists through in FPL and also just simply on real stats, right? Because obviously FPL assists are slightly different. And that's the simple reality. I think when you think about it, obviously Darwin has the ability to be quite a creative striker. He will be passing to players who are obviously more clinical than him. And that's enough to say that Darwin, I think, is a good pick, particularly when the fixtures are good. And I still think, for example, that actually, even though a lot of people are expecting a bench versus Sheffield United, that his chances of starting are also quite high, because I think it's either Luis Diaz or Darwin who actually loses their spot in the team. And we also know that, for example, when we're talking about the midfield, Gakpo can always come in and actually, for example, Luis Diaz and Darwin can still start. So we know that that can also be a reality for Sheffield United. So I won't be too concerned. Another thing too is that because they've completely won their Europa League group, there is an opportunity to simply rest Darwin on that fixture as opposed to resting him here versus Sheffield United. As far as, let's say, Alvarez and Isaac, I think here, for me, the Alvarez concern is simply just around your opportunities and your play around free at 18. I think Alvarez is still a great pick. In reality, for example, a lot of these City picks, you could almost imagine them as a slight tier above if, let's say, your strategy is to play free at 18. So that's one thing to say. As far as Isaac, though, I still think the concern is around minutes, managing minutes really around, for example, that next Champions League fixture. I think that, of course, his underlying stats have been really, really good this season. But of course, he hasn't played enough minutes where you'd say, compared to someone like Darwin, he's probably going to meet that level of underlying stats. With Watkins, we gave him a rise last week, but we didn't know about that sort of, injury, quote unquote, that Emery really didn't disclose to us. And of course, that's really, really annoying. But I would say right now with Watkins, unfortunately, the situation is that he is one of the best players in FPL. If you've moved out of Watkins, I think the best thing to do and think about Watkins is when you look at these tough fixtures, I do think you should persist with, let's say, a Darwin, an Alvarez, or an Isaac for the short term, and then move back to Watkins on Game Week 18. Because on Game Week 18, I think Watkins is going to be the clear and standout captaincy option. And in that game week, I would definitely be, for example, investing into Watkins then. As far as the defenders this week, not too many changes once again. I think the landscape is relatively routine, relatively standard. I've added Colwill onto the cheat sheet, but I still think that there's a bit of a risk, of course, that Colwill might not be playing all the games in the future because, of course, Cucurella is an option. I personally don't see why Cucurella would always play over Colwill, but the reality is that Cucurella has taken minutes away from Colwill, so that is a concern. Colwill scoring a goal doesn't really change too much because, of course, it's just a set-piece goal, but maybe it will change, let's say, Pochettino's mind on how strong a defense that he needs. For example, you're seeing teams like Man City play with multiple central defenders, and that is, for example, how they're lining up. Aston Villa as well. It might change, though, of course. Some teams will utilize fullbacks. Look at Spurs. They were able to, for example, create a great result versus Man City with a completely sort of different defensive structure. So it really just depends on what Pochettino wants. I think that Colwill, for example, is a nice price point here where you can say, okay, he's probably going to start most of the games here, and hopefully if you can get, let's say, Sheffield United at home, then he's a great option going forward. With Tsimikas, I actually think that he's, for example, stepped up in terms of how deserving he is of those starting minutes, and for that reason, of course, no reason to really budge on Tsimikas and Gabriel and Lascelles. Same with, for example, top options like Saliba and Porro. As far as Guecki, I think he falls, and obviously he's representative of really the Crystal Palace as a whole. The reality, of course, is that the good run of games for Crystal Palace is coming to an end. I think obviously I'll be taking out Crystal Palace defenders very shortly after the Bournemouth fixture, and I think the experiment with, let's say, Crystal Palace defenders has worked out well. I mean, you've gotten one clean sheet so far. Clean sheets are pretty hard to find right now in the Premier League, and honestly, some of the defenders who are doing well are those sort of really attacking fullback options, right? Players like Porro, players like Trent, players like Trippier, who can actually always find, in any sort of game situation, abilities to score, abilities to, let's say, create a goal. So that, I think, is the reality of FPL. Sometimes you'll get a perfect haul. For example, someone like Ben Mee, a centre-back, can obviously get 1 goal and 1 assist, but that's, of course, a lot more rare, and we sort of have to just take that on the chin in FPL. In terms of other positions, of course, yes, Trent has been amazing once again. He's basically been on an absolute tear the last few weeks. But I don't think that necessarily Trent, of course, needs to be an option that we move into immediately. I think one of the things that I need to recognize about Trent as well is that if you're a no Hollander, of course, I think going Trent makes a lot of sense because you need to fill up as much of your bank as possible. But of course, if you own Haaland, if you own Salah, it's very, very hard to own Trent. I think it's almost impossible virtually to own Trent unless you suddenly start to go extremely light on the midfield. You don't own options like Son. And one of the things that we've admitted, even going back, let's say 4 to 5 game weeks, is that players like Trippier, players like Son, you have to sort of make a decision between one of the two of them. And for example, this week, Trippier gets 12 points, Son gets 10 points, Trent gets 13 points. I think ultimately you just have to recognize that you have to sort of take your pick really out of those options and just sort of lie with them. Because every week it's not like Trippier is going to get suddenly 8 to 10 points unless he has, for example, a magical clean sheet run that he did, for example, at the start of the season after that really bad 4 to 5 game weeks. Right now, you have a player like Trent who actually has that beautiful run, so of course it makes sense to move into him. But for example, with a player like Trippier, you can, for example, expect that the next 2 games could be very tough for him to get a clean sheet. But ultimately, versus game week 17, versus Fulham, for example, he could actually get once again 12 points. And I think that's the landscape of FPL. You just have to sort of make those picks, understand that they're very good options, but also be prepared to take the blanks as they come. As far as the goalkeepers for this week, we have Dubravka as a new option. I think the news with Pope seems to be that he's going to be out for 4 months. Now, even if we take, let's say, a very sort of pessimistic point of view and expect that Pope will come back shortly, I do think a dislocated shoulder is a very, very serious injury. If you've been watching the fixture, for example, if you watch Newcastle versus Man United, you'll know that he barely could move. And of course, for a goalkeeper, it's very different to, for example, the Robertson situation, right? Because as a defender, as an outfield player, you need to use your shoulder a lot less. For a goalkeeper, really, I mean, most of their job requires, let's say, using that shoulder joint. And I think that that limited mobility is going to be much more significant for a player coming back from injury in Pope's case than, let's say, for example, Robertson's case. So I think we should actually be, even if we're pessimistic, understanding that Pope is probably not going to be coming back to the team shortly. Therefore, I think Dubravka, of course, is an incredible option. Not to mention, of course, that the fixture congestion schedule that we have in England here just means that Dubravka should play a ton of fixtures really in the short term. So that is what I would say. I think Dubravka becomes an astoundingly good option. Kelleher, I still have my doubts, made a pretty poor error, I think, with one of the saves when Tete scored, I believe, in that Liverpool game. I do think, of course, Alisson was one of those sort of key contributors to how good Liverpool is as a defense, how able they are to get clean sheets at times. You know, his overperformance in terms of saving goals has been huge, and I don't think Kelleher is at that standard. So for that reason, I don't think Kelleher makes too much sense as an option when you have Dubravka staring at you at the face. And I think that Newcastle team overall is a lot more put together when it comes to, let's say, getting clean sheets. I think Dubravka is the option to go with. As far as Areola, I think, of course, he falls as well. We've given, for example, Areola a good run of fixtures, right? And he's let's say, performed pretty under par. If anything, I think he's definitely underperformed his expectations. Now, there have been some key individual mistakes with this West Ham team, but the reality, as I've been saying for the last few weeks, is that they're a very, very poor defense. And there's no, for example, shock, in my mind at least, that they've ended up becoming, let's say, a bottom 3, bottom 4 sort of level of defense right now this season. So I do think it's time to move on away from Areola, or at least move into a structure where, of course, you're playing with Dubravka or playing with Raya or playing with Sanchez in the meantime. And no other change, of course, for the keepers right now. And that's going to be it. So thank you guys so much for watching the Game Week 15 cheat sheet. If you guys can also drop a like, drop a subscribe, even comment, for example, your thoughts in terms of players that I might be missing out, do let me know. And thank you once again to the members who are financially supporting this channel. Take care and goodbye.